In the early hours of the morning, while much of the world slept, a single operation crossed a line many believed would never be crossed in modern geopolitics when a sitting head of state was taken into custody by a foreign power without extradition, without an international tribunal, and without diplomatic negotiation, marking a moment that instantly reshaped global politics. Because this story is not just about one man, but about power, sovereignty, global order, and a dangerous precedent that could redefine how nations deal with their enemies. As Nicolas Maduro, long at the center of Venezuela's collapse from one of Latin America's wealthiest nations into economic ruin, marked by sanctions, corruption allegations, mass migration, and political repression, was suddenly removed from power after years of U.S. accusations involving drug trafficking, human rights abuses, and criminal conspiracy, accusations he has consistently denied. Yet, despite decades of pressure, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation, few ever believed a sitting president would physically be seized and tried in a foreign courtroom, until that assumption collapsed overnight when U.S. forces captured Maduro and transferred him into American custody, sending shockwaves across the world as images spread not of a leader addressing his nation, but of a detained figure escorted by armed officials, triggering reactions of shock, celebration, outrage, and fear, because this was no longer just about Venezuela, but about whether international law still mattered. And when Maduro appeared in a U.S. federal courtroom and pleaded not guilty to all charges while declaring himself a prisoner of war rather than a criminal, the phrase itself sent tremors through diplomatic circles as it reframed the event not as law enforcement, but as conflict, turning the legal battle into one of the most complex in modern history, where prosecutors argued he was no longer protected by sovereign immunity, while his defense warns that allowing one nation to seize another's leader meant no leader anywhere was safe, transforming the case from a drug trial into a struggle over global power. While back in Venezuela, the political vacuum ignited protests, celebrations, fear, and uncertainty as interim leadership stepped in, promising stability, even as the military and political elite recalculated their loyalties. All while Latin American governments watched nervously, some quietly welcoming Maduro's fall, while others feared the precedent, because today it was Venezuela, but tomorrow it could be anyone, prompting emergency meetings at the United Nations and carefully worded reactions from major powers who understood this was not a regional story but a global one, especially as deeper questions emerged about whether justice or strategy was the true motivation, given Venezuela's vast oil reserves and the immediate reaction of energy markets and investors, reinforcing the reality that in geopolitics, nothing happens in isolation. As supporters of the operation argued accountability had finally arrived, while critics warned that regime change by force was becoming normalized and international law was being replaced by raw power, a concern amplified by the fact that regardless of the trial's outcome, the precedent was already set, forcing future leaders to rethink security, alliances to shift, and trust between nations to erode, introducing uncertainty into a global system that depends on stability. While for the United States, the move projected strength, but also risked alienating allies and encouraging rivals to consider similar actions. And for Venezuela, the future remains uncertain, as the country stands at a crossroads between potential rebuilding and deeper fragmentation, leaving the world to confront an uncomfortable question about whether we are entering an era where power overrides law, borders become optional, and diplomacy gives way to force, because history rarely announces itself when it changes direction, yet sometimes a single moment stands apart, and this was not just the fall of a man, but a warning to the world, whose consequences are only beginning.